I've already got some great questions from the text. Do send me any more. I'll try and fit them all in. I'm going to go for a very quick one of my own, which is just because John raised it, the issue in the UK of the Labour Party. I don't know if I'm the sole historian in the room, but as one on the panel, certainly, I like to look at political parties and talk about, actually, they're a relatively new thing. They're only 150 odd years old in terms of the way in which we think about them in the modern world. Is the demise of the political party, are we moving into single issue campaign groups? And what does that mean for public administration if we do so?
I think we're just going through a great, profound period of change. And that until we start seeing some generation renewal, we're just going to have to endure a lot of disruption. But, you know, as I've been saying, I just don't see where the new thinking is coming from. And it's almost like the rising generation of leaders are trapped. And Tom Brokaw talked about the greatest generation being the Depression, World War II generation. Well, I think the only moniker we baby boomers are going to be called is the longest generation.
I think that's right. And I mean, look how difficult it has been to move on people who demonstrably have served their time and, you know, like, weren't that fantastic in the ministries of, you know, Turnbull or, you know, Abbott and on the Labor side. You know, just an extraordinary lack of full-length mirrors and insight. But, you know, and so where's the new thinking? It can't come from anywhere in the parties because we've got the cloning, we've got the relentless, you know, we might not win, but boy, I'm controlling my faction. And so that's why I'm actually really, I'm not optimistic that new parties will emerge, because I think what we've had, sorry, it's wandering around in my jacket, in Australia, the emergence of new kind of parties, they haven't been able to organise themselves. So we had the kind of the Palmer insurgency, we had the One Nation insurgency. They haven't actually been able to manage themselves, and whether Nick Xenophon can go from being, you know, a one-man band to a team remains to be seen. So I agree the political party concept is kind of, you know, a bit outdated. I can't see what's going to replace it, but equally they're horribly hollowed out. And
but in majoritarian systems, the entry costs of a new party are just too prohibitive.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's why they take a long time to die.
Yeah. They're doing their best, aren't they, from the feet up?
One of the best comments I encountered in the aftermath of Brexit was somebody saying that obviously UKIP had now achieved their aim, so, you know, what's left for them as a political party, not realising the sort of extent of them personifying a protest vote and how long it's taken for them to... Well, so we'll wait to see how they morph into something new.
In New Zealand, you know, with the current leader Andrew Little of the Labour Party, you can see that the problem is the discomfort about addressing the reconstructive fourth Labour government and its history and its consequences. So they'll all have a photo of Michael Joseph Savage, the leader of the great first Labour government. But what the modern Labour leaders don't seem to be able to do is be able to stand on both feet, both the legacy of the first Labour government and what it did in creating a welfare state, but also the fourth Labour government and its role as being at the vanguard of leading change. And so they're sort of stuck. They don't know where to move rhetorically or in terms of policy.
And in the Australian kind of context, you know, it was Whitlam and, you know, the people around him who formed his first cabinet who sort of took on the entrenched power brokers who were keeping them out of office. Well, people like that wouldn't get pre-selected now.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You know,
often
Whitlam wouldn't get pre-selected.
I talk to old stagers at home, and David Longy was certainly an exotic leader. But he had the ability, when it was needed, to convince a country that it needed to change from the course that it was on. And I'm pretty sure that David Longy wouldn't be selected by the Labour Party now.
So questions from the floor. One is, what about Canada and Trudeau? Now, if you ask my Canadian colleague, she'd say he is the bright shining light of the future. She might even say that he is the Messiah's second coming.
Yeah, but don't you think, I mean, I think he's very interesting. I think it's early days. And I think it's a bit like the first 12 and 18 months of Kevin before it all went bad. After you know, Howard and Harper, these people look so interesting and, you know, shiny and bright, and he's, you know, progressive and all that kind of stuff. The making it happen the delivery is going to be the challenge.
That will be his challenge, but I absolutely embrace Trudeau as being new generation. The fact that answer yesterday, that story yesterday about having 50% of women in his cabinet, why? Well, it's 2016. Simple as that. That's a new generational perspective, not, laboured by the baggage of the past or anything else. And yet in New Zealand, the Labour Party has had absolute nightmare trying to explain the exact same policy.
Okay, another question from the audience, specifically for you, John. What future impact do you see from the democratisation of information via the internet? Will this assist in closing the knowledge gap between elites and citizens?
I think we have to be patient. I think the first wave is a little bit unsettling, and I absolutely embrace that democratising aspect of it. But then again, I read blogs, and I just wish it would all go away. So my optimism is that second and third generations of internet-based commentary and analysis will improve upon what we have now. It's sort of a bit of a wild west, and we're sort of sorting out. And I think one of the speakers yesterday put it very well about this need to filter out noise. I'm an anachronism already in lots of ways, but one particular way is I do not do social media. I've got no interest in doing social media, and I don't actually believe my analysis is remotely affected by that choice.
Who self-identifies is very helpful.
Absolutely. So I'm going to combine a couple of these ones with one of my own one. He says, what does history tell us about practical ways to improve on current political class practices, and how could people in this room contribute? There was another question, which was, if public service leaders have no influence over the ills of our politics, what qualities and competencies do these leaders need to maintain and grow a professional public service? I'm going to jump in on this question. One of the things that we do at the Institute for Government, we don't just focus on the official side of things. We also talk to politicians and we work with them. We have two programmes. One is a series of reflections. We used to call them exit interviews, but we decided that was a bit dodgy. But they're interviews with departing ministers, some of whom have now re-entered government, which says something about the generational resurgence that goes on. But we use these to make sure that in our other work, which is actually working with ministers, we have a voice that isn't just us as being some pseudo-experts from the outside, but is actually their sort of predecessors talking about what it takes to be an effective minister. And we do a few different things in terms of learning and development. We do inductions with new ministers coming in. We also do team exercises with ministers in department where they work on team building. So questions to combine those two. I mean, what therefore, if you two had the option to design that kind of programme, what would be top of your agenda of things that perhaps ministers could learn that would help them in terms of better use of the public administrative system?
Well, ministers in this country have been very resistant to learning and development programs, because I'm elected, therefore I am. And I was in student politics, therefore I am. I know how to run this state, whatever. So, they've been very resistant. I've always, in my own academic work, really resisted offering prescriptions because, I learned from the presidential studies literature, they won't take them. There's an army of people who give advice to US presidents they take no notice of. What US presidents take notice of is what you've done, Catherine, at the Institute, which is drawing on the wisdom and experience of people who've been there, because they imagine that nobody knows what it's like to be them. So, my own view is that we need to start a dialogue with new and incoming MPs, because in a sense, by the time someone's a minister, they're actually socialised to, sort of think that they know everything. This is a horrible generalisation and a stereotype, but, so we've written books, learning to be a minister, that, sneakily found their way into different things. But getting them to focus, some of the things I outline in my essay are things like thinking about the transition to government. What might you want to do when you what do you want to be there for? All of these recommendations, all these ideas are actually in the Kemp review of the defeat in Victoria, that you can bet your life no one in the Liberal Party has read or contemplated. contemplated because they don't want to look back, they don't want to learn, they're incapable of learning for the reasons that I've kind of suggested. So I'm very attracted to the idea of professional development programs, but lots of people in this room could tell you how resistant they've been, and it's very unfortunate.
I think for leaders, the use of historical analogy is a very, very effective instrument. There's a great story about David Gergen, who worked for both Democratic and Republican presidents, said that in his experience, every president, once they confronted their first major foreign policy issue, their immediate question was, what would Nixon have done? Now, he might not be a good example in terms of integrity or what have you, but when it came to foreign policy, he knew his chops. And so, it's that type of thing. I mean, if I was trying to understand better this current epoch, I would probably go back to looking at the last disjunctive period, Callaghan, Muldoon in New Zealand, Fraser, and Jimmy Carter. That's where I'd be looking for. What were the types of strategies? Where's the space in a sort of vacuum type politics? Where's the space to still make positive, adaptive change for the societies that you lead?
Right. Really, the best and most promising people are voracious consumers of biographies, and really do think in those kind of framework ways. It's just I can't see huge numbers of them coming through.
And just two other points I'd make for public sector managers. In this environment where there is a lot of political flux. I think I was right first time. I would say lead by example, like we saw brilliantly in the speech last night. Show accountability, demonstrate accountability and demand it of others. And for people like Anne and myself and Catherine, be a critic in conscience. Don't be scared to stand up there and say things that people don't want to hear.
I think, from our point of view, we always say implementation and prioritisation are the two sort of key themes. The problem is that what politicians often judge as success for themselves are things that are very much in the public sphere, not necessarily actually achieving long-term aims. We've got a couple of questions, so if we've got microphones to hand, one at the back. I'm going to take both together, if that's okay, and then we'll double up on them. Yes?
Seems to me that, Gary Sturgis from ANZSOG, it seems to me that having developed an eloquent theory that explains the world, you need to then look for the counterfactuals. And I think there's lots of counterfactuals around. And if there's a counterfactual there, you need to ask, so what's going on? And if you look at, say, Baird in New South Wales, or if you look at, two very successful premiers in South Australia, in spite of that state having lots of, serious problems, the reality is that the old models are essentially working quite well. So, I agree the landscape has changed, but we're seeing politicians in fairly traditional models who are actually pulling this off, remarkably well. It may well be that you need people with pretty good instincts, and the current environment makes it harder for those to arise. I think, in the UK, in spite of my very strong dislike for the previous Tory leadership, the reality is that they took the UK people through the most swingeing cuts to public services. Beyond what we in Australia and New Zealand can conceive, and the British people and the public service have just accepted this. It's basically, okay, yep, get that. Now that needs explanation.
Yeah. Can I jump in with what I think is an explanation of the two cases? Well, not a comprehensive explanation, but the thing about Baird and about Weatherall is, what do we know about them? They respect traditions, they respect conventions, they use the cabinet process, they work with the public service, they do things that work. And they're grown-ups.
Yeah, and it is worth remembering that, yes, to some extent, in as much as obviously Cameron increased his majority to 12, which is a small majority, but at the time it felt like a massive success for him. But on the other hand, you could argue that we've seen the rise of the Corbynista as a result of those austerity cuts. It's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Okay, question here.
Look, a really similar question to one, or comment, and then question what Gary just raised. So, John, I accept your point that the Republican Party nationally collapsed and the GOP establishment looked almost powerless to stop the free pass, as you put it. And yet, at the state level, the GOP does incredibly well. It's got like 36, 38 governors. I think it dominates the state legislatures in the US. But with your green shoots, there's no question there was, apart from Rubio, who I think
Just didn't campaign well.
didn't campaign, purported to show he was a green shoot, but maybe he wasn't. The Democrats are similarly looking vulnerable. They've got a 68-year-old candidate, a 74-year-old aspirant with Bernie. Where would be the green shoots in both parties there?
I hear you, but this is why I think it's an in-phase politics. It suppresses what's rising up at the sort of more regional level. Can I just add about Sanders? I usually exclude Sanders. I don't see Sanders as much of a phenomenon at all. He was, from March, Hillary Clinton was going to win that nomination. Now there's been an enormous amount of noise since then. And I just saw before I came down, 96% of Sanders supporters are supporting Hillary Clinton. So I think Sanders is massively exaggerated. And in fact, but to your point, that's why Hillary is only a stopgap, and why I think a lot of people who study the presidency, and it's so, her biggest headwind is history. The absolute rarity of essential third terms by one party in office. She is a stopgap because the other side can't offer a compelling story or candidate. But she will be very, very lucky to survive more than one term. And why I use the Skowronek stuff is that next reconstruction is probably inching closer and closer in the American situation, and it could go in either direction, right? It could be that the Republicans lead the next reconstruction, and Skowronek does have as one of his 4 options for the future that reconstructions are now only possible on the right. And she may then actually end up being the Carter in the story.
Okay, one last comment and a question, which I think importantly brings us back to the topic that we've been here to discuss. So the comment, if we are seeing adaptive governance and it's not just about the core executive, and if it is about the core executive and not just cabinet, then surely, however baronial the politics, if you want change, you need the public service. Well, I think we can all agree with that. But importantly, what does it all mean for civil servants and how they need to approach the future? I mean, it's a good question. What does this political system mean for the way... I mean, do we have a public service that has not yet adapted to it? Can it adapt to it?
I think the public service has done a heroic job in dealing with the ambiguities and the inconsistencies and the incompatibilities. I think it's done an extraordinary job in doing that. And that's why I was so heartened. The problems of institutional memory, I'm so confounded about why Prime Ministers can't learn. It just does my head in. Because, we've now had this kind of succession of things. Which bit of this don't they understand? Not planning, not using cabinet. These are the things that are really hurting them. Who are the guardians of that stuff? Who are the stewards of that stuff? It's the public service. And so I don't understand why they don't seem to be able to come to grips with that. I really don't. And I think, my point is not that the public service is an important part of it. It's just that other people need to take the argument up. And in a way, other people have started taking the argument up. CEDA, the Business Council of Australia, started making these arguments in 2013. But I think we actually need, and it's interesting that journalists, or good long-form journalists like Laura and, George Megalogenis and kind of others are kind of having these debates, that are looking at systemic kind of issues. And I think, the extent that people like us can make those things digestible and accessible is going to be helpful, I hope, to the long-term enterprise. Because, and I really thought Peter Varghese summed it up. It is at your peril that you endanger these kinds of institutions because they're very fragile.
Does it come back to frank and fearless advice again, saying, look, I know this was your manifesto agenda, but let's go back to what it is that you're trying to achieve. Let's think about how you want to achieve long-term change.
Yeah, but you're assuming people do want to achieve long-term change.
Yeah, true.
And I suppose my argument is the last several governments have come to power without an agenda. State level, federal level, they've come to on a, the agenda of A, winning, and B, what I'm not going to do. So I think, some of the things I outline in the essay is, well, let's try and get people to think about transition planning. Barry O'Farrell did that. Barry O'Farrell went around and talked to people about how this stuff would work. That's what gave the foundation for Baird to be able to do that. I mean, what do you want to be in power for? And it's less and less clear to me, with some of the governments that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay, I might be a little bit of a heretic here. Be a resilient Sisyphus. Get used to the ball rolling back down and hitting you on the head, but have that unwavering commitment that logic will work in the end, long-term will prevail, and as a personal strategy, sidle up to long-term thinkers inside and outside of the public sector and politics. Strategic location, I think, is everything in politics. So surround yourselves with people who think vigorously about future possibilities rather than, and then just protective coloration, do what you have to do to get through the day.
I think many of us thought that's what Turnbull was doing. I think that's what we thought Turnbull was drawing in, that kind of experience and expertise and those lessons and some of these other things. This is why I'm really kind of struck by that Jonathan Raunch essay that I do recommend to you. It's so amazing. That now the problem is on the inside. That the problem is less the opponents and more the opponents on the inside. So I think it's a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma, and one that I hope is transitional, and I really hope that logic will prevail in the end. Other than that, I think we should just kidnap Bill English and swap him for, I don't know, however many you think it would take to go over the Dutch.
It feels like we're ending on a slightly pessimistic note, but I hope not. I overly always love to plug the Institute's work, but there is a series of studies we did quite a few years ago on policy successes, and we looked at a number of different case studies, many of which were long-term sort of changes that people tried to institute. And it's really interesting there, the different forces that are required to bring together consensus, to bring, especially cross-party consensus, over an issue, over a long-term issue. It's a big issue that the UK is struggling with at the moment about how to deal with these long-term policy problems and what's required for those. So do have a look at those, and maybe there's a few glimmers of hope there. If not, perhaps the next session will provide the glimmers of hope that we're looking for. If you could all join with me in thanking the panel, and thank you.